Shabbat Shalom. As we look to our Torah portion this week, we find one of the more challenging ethical dilemmas in the history of our people. In Parshat Bo, we witness the last three plagues of Egypt: locusts, deep, debilitating darkness, and most hauntingly, the death of the firstborn sons. The thought of the immense loss of life, this hopeless feeling of the children, of the parents, it's really just too much to bear. The plague struck Egyptians of every generation, of every walk of life, meaning siblings lost brothers, parents lost sons, and many children lost their fathers, from Pharaoh's family all the way down to the Egyptian servants and captives. The final plague is a colossal bloodshed. And it makes us question, is this the way that we want to obtain our freedom? Does this feel like justice? Sometimes the narratives that we read in Torah make us question even the most authoritative powers of the world. Although the plagues that rained down upon Egypt in last week's Parsha seem almost absurd in nature in comparison. There's blood and there's frogs and fiery hail. And while seemingly a bit bizarre, these plagues too raise complex questions about collective responsibility and collective guilt. These are wide, sweeping plagues over an entire nation, from those responsible for the enterprise of human slavery to those powerless to change the oppressive system. However, in Parshat Bo, the ultimate result of Pharaoh's stubbornness is the murder of every firstborn Egyptian male, which directly leads to our freedom. And so we must ponder, does one heinous crime justify another? And how can we learn to love and to trust a God who allowed our enslavement and then slays the guilty together with the innocent? This form of collective punishment, in my eyes, seems to be deeply unjust. And in an attempt to redeem God for unjust behavior, the author Adina Gerver writes, rather than framing the plagues as unjustly targeting the innocent, we might say that the collective punishment teaches us about our collective responsibility to free the oppressed. Viewed through this lens, the plagues point to a wider circle of responsibility beyond one national or ethnic group. The Egyptians at the lower echelons of society were responsible for the wrongs dealt by the more powerful among them. And even further still, they were held liable for the well-being of the minority in their midst, the Israelites. And we can derive from this powerful notion of collective responsibility that extends from each human being to all human beings. In Miss Gerver's words, we can hear the influence of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously said in 1972, "Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." Heschel's words fit into the story of the Exodus in some fascinating ways. Even if we wanted to argue that the Egyptian servants and the Egyptian captives were unable to stop the enslavement of the Israelites, we see that their silence is dooming. Their punishment is perhaps a message to us that to be silent in the face of injustice is to be implicit in the act itself. Admittedly, this account of our God has, over the years, caused me a great deal of distress. This depiction of God undiscerningly murdering thousands and thousands, it is heartbreaking. And on a certain level, it's even a little embarrassing that it is such a central part of our origin story. How do we rationalize love for a God like this? Just as we might attempt to justify the inappropriate behavior of a close friend or a loved one, it is only natural that we search for interpretations of this biblical account that rationalizes God's actions. We do not want to admit to ourselves or others that sometimes our friends or our relatives are beyond the pale of morality, beyond forgiveness. So how do we keep our faith in Parshat Bo? One such interpretation could be found in the very name of the Parsha. The opening verse states, God said to Moses, Bo, come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order that I may place these signs of mine in his midst. And so this verse, opening verse, is interesting. It's a little troubling, especially for those who are quite familiar with the Hebrew. The verb that invites Moses to deliver the last three plagues is bo, come. Would it not make more sense if the Torah stated lech, go, and not bo, come? Why is Moses now told come? When I tell someone to come somewhere, to a place, it means, more often than not, that I'm already in that place. The implication of the word bo, the implication of come, is that that is where God is to be found, that God is with the Pharaoh. Further, why does God not just pluck the Jewish people out of Egypt? Why must they gain permission from Pharaoh first? What is the benefit of this giant morality play? Why the plagues? There's many, many reasons. But we have God's protection and God's miracles. Would that not be enough? To answer these questions, we should take a step back in the narrative. In the closing chapters of the book of Bereshit, when Jacob was both excitedly but also reluctantly descending down into Egypt to reunite with his son Joseph, Jacob was visited by God and told, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid of going down to Egypt, for there I will make you a great nation. He says, I, Anochi, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I, Anochi, will also bring you up. Adonai consoled Jacob that God, God's self, is going down into Egypt. We cannot overstate the power of this statement. Not only were the Jewish people going into exile, but even God was putting God's self, confining God into an exile with the Jewish people. That Anochi, that I, was locked away in the thickness of the world, in the dense materialism of Egypt, and imprisoned in the deep darkness of Pharaoh's heart. And it is from that unlikely hiding place that God declares to Moses, Bo, come. The book of the Zohar states, there is no light like the light that comes from darkness. And so that which would emanate from the most dismal and dark place in the world is the brightest of lights. Just allow me to repeat that just again. I think it's beautiful. There is no light like the light that comes from darkness. And so that which would emanate from the most dismal and dark place in the world is the brightest light. And so out of the deepest darkness shines our light of redemption. There is a midrash which tells a parable regarding a very poor woman who was rummaging amongst the stalks in the field in search of food until one day a king saw her and took her to his palace as a princess. And thereafter the other woman said to her in wonder, yesterday you were rummaging amongst the stalks, and today you are sitting in a royal carriage. And the woman replied, just as you are amazed, so I am amazed. And similarly, the Midrash says, the nations of the world said to the children of Israel, yesterday you were slaves in Egypt, and today you are the chosen people crowned with Torah. And the Israelites replied, just as you are amazed, so are we amazed. Our light, our freedom, could only be emanated out of the deepest of darknesses. So much of our tradition has little to do with the right now and so much to do with the impact on the future generations. We are told to tell this story to our children year after year, and it is not to frighten them, it is not to cause any unease in cultivating a meaningful relationship with God, but we want to build better lives for our children. We want them to know securities and comforts that perhaps we do not. And the redemption of the people of Israel out from Egypt is not so much about alleviating the harshness of slavery from that generation, but rather avoiding slavery altogether in the future generations. The amazement of the children of Israel in this midrash likely has less to do with themselves and much more to do with the future generations of the Jewish people. And as we consider the immense loss of adolescent life in the last two portions, from the edict to kill all Hebrew male children to the death of the firstborns of Egypt, we cannot help but think of the sacred relationship between parent and child, the heartbreaking sense of loss, the loss of trust, the loss of innocence, the loss of innocent souls. I'd like to conclude this morning with the poetic words of Khalil Gibran, who writes about the relationship between parents and children in his seminal book, The Prophet. Addressing every parent of a child, he writes, "You are bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forward. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite. He bends with you, and his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves the bow that is stable." It is one of my favorite passages, and I always took it to mean that although our children fly forward into the infinite unknown, it is our work to create a stable and sturdy and joyful bow from which they fly. And God is present in this relationship as well. In life, we parents are the bow, our children the arrow, and God is the archer, in whose hands both of us are held. In this narrative of Exodus, we find that we Israelites are the arrow, and God is both the bow and the archer. While we may have some discomfort with the way in which we reach our freedom, we trust that the bow and the archer that shot us out from Egypt did so with love and with care. Our modern sensibilities concerning the 10th plague may cause us to question the morality of our sacred history. But we take solace in knowing that God went down into Egypt with us and brought us out of Egypt as well. I'd like to give the final words to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom, who teaches, there are stories that ennoble and others that do not, leaving us prisoners of ancient grievances or impossible ambitions. The Jewish story is, in its way, the oldest of all, yet ever young, and we are each a part of it. It tells us of who we are and who our ancestors hoped we would be. Storytelling is the great vehicle of moral education. It was the Torah's insight that a people who told their children the story of freedom and its responsibilities would stay free for as long as humankind lives and breathes and hopes. Ken Yehi Ratzon, Shabbat Shalom.